The whole American experiment is up for grabs.
We're going to hopefully encourage Christians to get involved in election 2024 and do now what we can't do on November 6th. Welcome to Countdown to Decision 2024, a project of the James Dobson Family Institute, where we equip you and encourage you to get involved in this unique election season as a Christian by doing what you can do now and what you can't do on November 6th, the day after the election. I'm joined by my wonderful co-host, Joseph Backholm.
Alison, good to be with you again. I really do love this project because every single day, it seems, there is news that highlights how important it is what we're doing this year in this season between now and November 5th in selecting our next generation of leaders. And we have a special guest today. Dr. Tackett is literally a legendary worldview leader. He's the architect and teacher of the Truth Project, which I know so many people are going to be familiar with. He's a regular biblical worldview contributor to JDFI as well. In addition, he served more than 20 years as an officer in the U.S. Air Force. Also, he served in the George H.W. Bush administration. Dr. Tackett, thank you so much for taking some time to be with us today.
It's my pleasure, Joseph, and great to be with you, Alison, as well.
Well, and Dr. Tackett, your span of ministry, I think, is insightful because one of the things that many people know you by is the Truth Project. You are now working on the Engagement Project, which, as the name suggests, is an effort to get people to engage. What's the connection, as you understand it, between the truth and what we think we know is true and what we do about it in the way we engage in the world around us?
Well, my call from the very beginning, which really happened at the White House, as a matter of fact, changed the direction of my life, was to do everything I could to get the body of Christ healthy. And from that perspective, building a biblical worldview was the first thing that had to happen to get the body of Christ, firm in a systematic, comprehensive biblical worldview. But just having a worldview is not sufficient. Because God calls us to be stewards in this world that He's placed us in. And that means that we have to be engaged. We have to engage with the world around us. And so the Engagement Project points us in a direction that I think is critically important for the families who are in Christ. But that also includes the whole notion associated with, what we call political involvement. But I think it's involvement in every one of the social institutions that God has given to us.
What trends have you seen? You mentioned that decades ago now you saw this idea, you felt called to this idea of we need to help equip the church to become what God intended them to be, to educate the church, give them a biblical worldview. What are the trends that you've seen since you first developed that passion and began to work in that space?
Well, I'll tell you, Joseph, I think it's more than just trends. I mean, there are some cases where it's not. You look at it and you say, this isn't even a trend. This is like a wholesale avalanche that has occurred where a lot of people, I know a lot of people would sit back and say, this wasn't a trend because we didn't see this coming. So I think we're in this mode right now, which I think probably comes as a result, if you talk about a trend, as we descend deeper and deeper into selfishness that is beyond just what I guess this culture used to recognize as somebody being selfish. And now we've descended into what I believe is like Homo Deus. So that's the divinity of the individual. That my heart speaks divine things, and I expect you to bow down to that divine proclamation as if were a god. And if you do not, then we will punish you with our blasphemy laws.
Yeah, for those that are, catching up to kind of politics right now, they go, okay, I got to take my head out of the sand and pay attention to what's going on. I have to make a big decision here in a couple of weeks. What would you say, Dr. Tackett, should drive Christians to not just vote, but also to educate and encourage others right now? I mean, is it a couple set of social issues? Can you talk to us about really what's standing out to you and should drive Christians to get engaged when right now, obviously politics is a dirty, ugly game and no candidate's perfect. And we're seeing those wars take off right now.
Well, there's a whole lot there, Alison, and I think it's critically important for us. That's why I think a biblical worldview is important and critical. So if you step back for just a second and think about how God has designed not only us, but designed social order. And that social order should be viewed by us as believers as divine institutions. The family is a divine institution. It was created by God, as well as the state. The state is a divine institution. And for the life of me, it's hard to understand how people can say that God doesn't care about politics. He does. Oh my goodness, the entire Old Testament, if you look at the Old Testament, Elijah was called to speak to Ahab, to say, you do wrong. Elisha was called to stand before the kings. Jeremiah was called to speak against the kings. Those are political activities. And when Jesus had two guys come back from the Old Testament, Elijah and Moses, those are the two most politically active guys in the entire Old Testament. God cares about nations. You cannot read the word without understanding he cares about nations. We should have that same kind of care for the institution that God has created. We call it the state. At least in the Truth Project, we referred to it as the institution of the state. God is the one who has instituted that, and we should have a heart for that. And when it's going astray, we should have not only the heart for it, but the arms and feet to act, to do what we can, to bring, as best we can, the institution back towards God's design. So it's tough for me. And I talk to people who say, God doesn't care about politics. It's hard for me not to drop into a big lecture.
And Dr. Tackett, to that point, where do you see the disconnect? Because the vision of government that you just described there with Elijah and Moses and Jeremiah being, as you described it, very politically active in their own context, of course, because God cares about what government does. Why is that a vision of government and of the state that much of the church doesn't share? Because there's a really strong sentiment that, there's a very clear separation between church and state. Mm-hmm. We don't want to mingle those two. And it's in some case virtuous to just abstain and withdraw from that arena. Where does that difference come from in your mind?
Well, I actually think it comes from several places. Number one, it's the loss of a biblical worldview. So when we don't have that biblical worldview and we have shrunk Christianity down to this very small slice of life, then we lose that understanding that God has not only spoken in every area of life, but in the cases we're talking about now, he has created those institutions, and those institutions were to bring him glory. Okay, so if you lose the biblical worldview, then you lose the understanding that God is the one who's designed these and we need to be a part of it. The second thing is selfishness. I think a lot of what's behind all of this, the reality is somebody will come up with a justification as why we shouldn't be involved in politics because they don't want to be involved in politics. And so, we fallen creatures have this great tendency always to try to justify why we have to get our way. And so we can do it in very pious ways. And so we can even preach in a way that helps justify the reason why I don't speak about political things. But I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's biblically correct. And so if we really want to follow God's design and do what God has called us to do, we ought to be people who care about righteousness and care about unrighteousness when it prevails, to do away with vile things in the land, to be a part of trying to bring about righteousness. And in terms of, the impact on people, do we care about people? Let me tell you, public policy has an impact on people, a huge impact on people. And so to me, to say, I don't want to deal with politics is, well, you don't really care about people being hurt, because there's a lot of public policy today that's hurting people.
we have heard from some Christians, well, you don't care about people at the border, or you don't care about X demographic of people because you're limiting their ability to live the way they want to live, or to read the books that they want to read to our kids in the library, or to compete in certain sports. You don't care about the women who are pregnant and they need an abortion to be able to go off and run their business or live out their dreams. There's a compassionate casting of Jesus, right? In some that they use against us as Christians. And right now we're seeing on the left use that idea of compassion and joy and fun, and let's not actually look at policies. Let's kind of run off of the vibe.
Well, it's a great comment, Alison, because I really believe that the primary ethic that drives our culture today is compassion, but it's a malevolent compassion. And I think that's why it's important for us, not only adults, but for our children. We need to sit down and help our children understand, just because someone uses the word compassion, or maybe you even feel compassion, that does not mean that is a righteous thing. The scripture, for example, would say, if a man won't work, he won't eat. Today, we would say that is not compassionate. But see, God cares about it. The reason God says, I'm not gonna feed you, is because I want you to be hungry. And the reason I want you to be hungry is not because I'm mean. I want you to be hungry because I want that hunger to drive you to do what you need to do that which will be good for you. So we can use compassion. I think it's a demonic thing. I will just say it. It's a demonic thing to pull our culture into thinking that compassion is always the right thing, and it is not. The malevolent compassion that we see happening today doesn't want anybody to be uncomfortable, doesn't want anyone to have to suffer from anything. That is not a biblical pathway for people. It's not a biblical pathway for children. Children need to be trained by adversity. They need to be trained by discipline. If they are not, then actually what you're doing is you're dooming them. And we see the consequences of that today. People cannot handle adversity. I'll be open here. If you don't use my pronoun, then I have to go through therapy. Those are people who they haven't been trained by adversity. Why? Because malevolent compassion has attempted to destroy any discipline, any consequences, so that if your actions result in bad consequences, God would say that's good. You need to suffer because that hopefully will wake you up. That's what his judgment does, is to try to wake us up. His discipline does that. So this is a huge area, Alison, because I think malevolent compassion has become the prime ethic in our culture. Virtually every public policy is now brought by the litmus test of compassion, but it's not righteous compassion.
Dr. Tackett, if I may, in a follow-up to that, are you suggesting, because I think a lot of people listen to that and say, well, that means you want people to suffer because you think it's good for them. Is that in fact what you're saying? Are you saying that we can just be indifferent to people suffering because God's going to use it to make them, grittier?
I remember when our firstborn daughter did not want to eat anything green. If it was green, she would not eat it. And so my wife and I decided that the best thing for her was to sit in that high chair until she finally decided she was going to eat a green pea or a green bean. Now, someone might say, you enjoy seeing your daughter suffer. And I say, absolutely not. I don't enjoy that. But I do know what is best for her in the long run. And I do know that the part of the training associated with children, and that includes adults as well, we need to be continually trained by the righteousness of God. And so, sure, there will be people who would say, well, you just enjoy seeing people suffer. And I said, well, that's totally wrong. You know, that is just a false accusation, because the reason I'm doing this is because I do care. You know, the same thing. Let me tell you, I have very, very personal experience with the homelessness and so forth. Your compassion can drive you. If a homeless person wants money from you, your compassion can drive you to give them money. And I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10, that will be turned into drugs, alcohol, and so forth. Now, you may feel better by giving them money. And I think that's what a lot of this has to do here. So I can feel better because I've done something compassionate, but in the end, I have hurt that individual. It could well be that I am the one that finally put him over the end. So I agree that accusation can be made. But if we just look around the whole system of life, and the training that we go through, I think it's clear that God isn't happy when he disciplines us. He doesn't say, wow, I can't wait to discipline you, because he loves to see you suffer. No, God loves us, and he disciplines us. Why? Because that discipline will train us towards righteousness.
And the laws he gives lead you to flourishing, right? It's not a law. Hey, eat a pea is not, I want to see you suffer. It's to help you grow. It's to help you stay within the bounds of order. I think that's a really cool example. Listen, I have a question, Dr. Tackett, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. I think biblical worldview is what we're focusing on the church. We're seeing come against that biblical worldview is communism, Marxism, socialism. And we've been diving in deep here, Joseph and I, as we prepare for the election season and what we're up against. Lots of people saying Jesus was a socialist. He would have brought everything together and divided it up and given to everyone in need. That is a really serious claim by many on the left towards our religion and towards how they think we're getting it wrong when we want less taxes or we desire to keep the fruits of our labor, give to our church at our own compulsion, not by giving at the force of the government. So can you walk those who don't understand the threat of Marxism and socialism, what that would look like? Why can't we just be a socialist country and divide it up and everyone gets the same amount?
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, Alison. This is what I call a demonic worldview. I've done a lot of study, as have other people. If you're familiar with Richard Wurmbrand, who was a Romanian pastor, he was horribly tortured underneath this whole Marxist theology and worldview. And he did a serious study on the life of Marx, and he wrote a book called Marx and Satan. And the reason that title was on his book was because he was convinced that the Marxist worldview really came from Marx selling himself to Satan. I mean, it sounds so weird for us to say those things. I think Payne in his biography and other people, and there's a lot of evidence. I spent time reading Marx's poetry, and honestly, I would tell people, don't read it. It is so dark. It is so demonic. But Marx, I think, was used, therefore, as a tool by the enemy to bring forth a worldview which has destroyed millions and millions. We're talking about mass graves. Millions and millions of people have been slaughtered at the throne of Marxism. And so, and to some extent, Marx kind of represents that image we see in Revelation. I'm not trying to pull us there, but, you know, the beast that we thought had a fatal wound, but then revived, because it has revived in Western culture. But it didn't revive in the economic way that Marx originally started it. It revived by trying to pit minorities against others, because the economic attempt to try and in America, for example, to help lower caste lower class and middle class people believe that they are oppressed by the upper class. That didn't fly here. And it didn't fly here because people say, well, wait a second, I have a job, I have 2 cars, I have a TV, and so forth. And so they had to find another way to bring about this revolution. And that revolution then came about as a result of finding people that we label minorities and to convince them they were oppressed. And they were oppressed and had to then overthrow the ruling class. But Marx wanted to not just overthrow the ruling class, he wanted to destroy all of God's institutions. That is why the phrase in Marxism from the very get-go was abolish the family, for example. Marx hated God and he hated everything that God had brought to us. All of the institutions that God, the human sexuality, marriage, family, church. He hated the church. Even labor. He wanted to destroy the notion, as God had designed, that people would work and labor and then be blessed by the fruit of their labor. He wanted to pull all of that into the hands of the state and to destroy the means of production and bring that up into the state, because the state becoming the owner of everything was supposedly then going to be in the position to be able to distribute everything equally. But we know there has not been one instance in the history of man where Marxism has truly done that. When we finally went into Berlin, which was almost like going from a world of colors into a black and white world, the only palaces on the other side of that wall were held by the Marxist elites. So in reality, and I think the bottom line here, Alison, is that people need to understand Marxism is a scam. It is a scam. And it will use, Lenin's music, for example, Imagine, and it will lay out in this music this beautiful utopia associated with not everybody has the same amount, and so you can work 12, 16 hours a day in the farm and raise crops and not feel bad about the guy who sits around on the couch watching TV earning the same amount you do. And that's a utopia. It doesn't exist. It will never exist, and it hasn't existed, and it won't now, but it is this utopian dream that the enemy lays before you, just like he laid before Eve in the garden. He laid before her a utopia that can't ever happen. You will never be like God, ever.
Dr. Tackett.
So Marxism is that scam.
Yeah, and if I can, I want to make sure I understand how you're defining this term Marxism, and then make sure people understand what you mean by that, because there's the sense that, well, Marx is dead. Few people are running around today saying, I am a Marxist. There are some. But you talk about the war between the bourgeois and the proletariat that he set up, and the justification that people had to murder millions of people in the name of their liberation. Now, that was categories of the oppressors and the oppressed based on economics. But we now have seen that happen with gender, where the men are the oppressors of the women, with race, where the white people are the oppressors of the non-white people, with sexual orientation, where the straight people are the oppressors of the non-straight people. Is that what you mean when you say Marxism today is still kind of relevant and still wreaking this damage, because we're still dividing ourselves into the oppressors and the oppressed based on these categories, and we're importantly justifying actions against those who have been identified as the oppressors just because they are the oppressors?
Yes, absolutely, because that is the worldview of Marxism. And that worldview. There was a book that was written a number of years ago by Dave Breeze. It was called 7 Men Who Rule the World from the Grave. It's a great title because what he is basically saying is, if I can change your worldview, I can rule you way after I'm in the grave. And Marx is one of those. And so it's that worldview that it morphs a little bit, but it doesn't matter. It's the same kind of thing. And you articulated it well. What we do now is we search for more and more people who can believe the notion that they are oppressed, and the solution is to destroy their oppressor. And so that's what the rise of the whole intersectionality, where you can kind of grade, how far are you on the scale of being oppressed. So I guess that can then relate to how much anger you should have. But so we seek to find people who are oppressed. So, we have the whole transgender thing, which has arisen quickly to provide a new oppressed class. But we also have now the criminal. So the criminal becomes the oppressed. And back to Alison's note, then malevolent compassion will cause us to say, well, look at these poor criminals. And why are they criminals? They're criminals because of this oppressive society around them. And so this is what's demonic. We switch everything around. So all of a sudden, the criminal becomes the righteous person, and the property owner becomes and the property owner becomes the oppressor. And so all these things associated with owning property and so forth. Now, here's the reality why it's a scam, because you can get someone to buy into all of this. And the Democratic Party, from my perspective, had bought the whole load, okay? And and that's why you look at the border situation. And it will always be couched in terms of people who are oppressed, and you who are trying to say you can't come in are the oppressor. But if they owned a coal store, they wouldn't do that, right? You wouldn't say, okay, or a Sam's or Costco or whatever, and say, you know what, you really ought to let anybody in here and let them take whatever they want. So, well, now that's impacting them personally, and so all of a sudden, they become a capitalist immediately. But see, Marxism is a scam that if we can somehow get the state power, because it's the elites who want the power, and we can convince you to join us, you will find in the end that it was just a scam, and that is exactly what will happen here. That's what will happen here. We are spinning ourselves into bankruptcy, and eventually people are going to say, we got scammed. All of us got scammed.
Can we get super practical for a moment? Because let's say, somebody is accepting this idea that we shouldn't be categorized based on some superficial wealth, race, gender category. We should be treated as individuals based on who we are, the things that we've done. That's a more just way to treat people. But how do we apply that in the next several weeks when we make voting decisions? How do we recognize the ways in which we're heading the wrong direction, and how do we lend our support so that we're going to build public policy that recognizes each individual as individuals, that treats us as individuals, so we can move away from this kind of class identity politic warfare that you've described so well?
Right. And I think it's a good point, Joseph, and my advice to people has been this, and that is that it is very easy to get caught up in the emotions of this political fight, and I think it's unfortunate. We have words that are said that should never be said. We have emotions that are expressed that should never really be expressed. There are a lot of lies. There are so many lies that it is hard to even know where there's truth anymore. And so I basically tell people, look, your decision needs to be based upon what the platform says. I would even say, don't even listen to all of this rhetoric anymore. Just read the platform, because the platform is what will happen. If you go back to Obama, he was interviewed beforehand. The whole issue of what we call traditional marriage and the DOMA Act and all of that stuff. He was You know, I am going to fight for that. I am for that. And then guess what happened? The platform was what he ran when he was president and lit the White House in rainbow colors. So there's you can listen to the DNC, you can listen to the speeches, you can listen to what the candidate is saying right now, which is so radically different than everything she stood for in the past, and you can maybe say, wow, she's changed, or you can say, okay, maybe this is all just part of this lie that's going on here to get elected. Read the platform, because the platform is going to tell you exactly what this party is going to do. Make your decision based upon that.
I think that's really, really wise. Just read the platform. You know, I was just watching the news yesterday. They said, you know, Kamala has never said that she would decriminalize border crossings. And I went, it's in the platform. I just read it the other day. Like, just to know what's in the platform will allow you to be a more empowered voter, and I think a more empowered communicator. Because like you said, Dr. Tackett, it's kind of hard to know, well, who's lying here? He said, she said. But if you can read each platform, you'll know what they are promoting and what's really going to happen once they're in office. You know, we're coming up on the end.